Welcome back to our panel discussion, Best Practices for the Hybrid Cloud in Government, sponsored by Iron Bow here on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. My guests today are Greg Judge, Deputy Director for Operations and Architecture for the CIO G6 at the Army, Andre Mendez is CIO for the International Trade Administration at the Department of Commerce, Troy Massey is Director of Enterprise Engagements at Iron Bow Technologies, and Brandon Lockhart is Director of Data Analytics at Iron Bow Technologies. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And before we came to a break, we were talking about some of the cost elements, and those really have to be watched carefully by government because government is a cost-driven operation. I guess so are corporations, really, for that matter. And Brandon, you had mentioned earlier about the idea of balancing workload that might be spiking, that you really need capacity, versus something that's more steady state or deep, cheap storage and so forth. What are some of the kaleidoscope of elements that you need to mix into your cost considerations and forecasting?
Right, so not only are there the traditional costs of your network, your compute, your storage in the cloud, but you also have all these licensing costs that you may or may not now have to consider. In your private cloud, if you're running some analytic workloads or doing some machine learning, and you have to bring up these GPUs with additional licenses, more hardware, at the end of the day, that's a cost that you have to plan for over the course of the lifespan of that system. One of the benefits of the cloud is that if you're looking into something like machine learning, you can spin your data set into the cloud and then pay by the drink. Use the GPUs, be able to hammer away at the data, get your results out, and then turn the system off. So you're not having to expend all this cost on these licenses that you now have sitting in the corner, just collecting dust, and able to then transition them into the mission and use those funds to better serve the customer.
Sure, and Greg, as the Army knows the cost of every bullet, and so looking back in computing history, when memory got cheap, software got fat. And storage, it got cheap, and so everyone stored a lot. Now virtual machines are cheap, but you can overdo it there too. So what are some of the ways you look at the total cost of all of this?
Yeah, that's a very good analogy. So we actually have some case studies that we've been running over the past year to get exactly what Brandon was talking about in terms of, in a traditional data center, the machines are running 24/7, 365. In our cloud environment, they're running during business hours only. And so we have actually been able to quantify cost savings simply by doing something of changing the culture of the O&M organization to when they leave on a Friday night, last thing they do is they spin the development environments down or spin the test environments down so that we're not paying those costs over the weekend. It's turning out into, in some cases, tens of thousands of dollars just for a single batch of applications, for example. So we believe as we scale out to the size of the Army, who's, as you probably realized, has thousands of applications. This is going to turn into very significant dollars going forward.
Could be millions a day, basically.
Could very well be, and we probably will be millions a day. And we intend to be able to take those dollars and reharvest those to mission priorities that the Secretary and the Chief have dictated on us.
Yeah, and maybe even closer to the ground, it gets you away from that capital expenditure model toward more managing the operations. And
absolutely true, and that's really Army's approach. Is we want to get out of the infrastructure business on the bottom line and turn all of those capital investments into O&M type of expenditures. We can manage those much easier, and frankly, it will generate cost savings for us going forward in terms of managing those capital assets.
And Andre, you've kind of made it to the OpEx, if you will, model for the International Trade Administration, but how do you make sure that doesn't get out of control? Or that it's reasonable for what it is you're demanding of it?
Sure. The entire premise here is to create an environment where you minimize any amount of money that you're spending on something that is not directly contributing and directly related to the mission, right? And so effectively what our strategy has done is commoditize an enormous amount of our entire technology stack so that it becomes completely invisible to us except as an invoice, right? And that has implications not only from a vendor standpoint, but also from a personnel standpoint, because the moment that I go into software as a service, for example, right, I no longer need to worry about all of the administrators associated with that. And so, or the disaster recovery associated with that, and all of those things that you need to worry about, and testing environments and everything else. And so it becomes a constant chase of sort of supply chain optimization, so that as you create more and more abstraction layers for all of your computing environment, you are left with spending money on the value proposition for your agency, for your bureau, for your company, where you actually get the value, right? It's not unlike biological evolution, where we have created an environment from a Homo sapiens standpoint where we spent all of our energy on this functioning. Rather, everything else has been abstracted, and we just eat and it gets done. Right? It's our invoice. You put in food, and the body does everything. Right? And so you concentrate on the brain. That's exactly the same thing that we're trying to achieve. So, the optimum scenario is that you're spending 100% of your money on applications, on data, and on analytics, right? So that you can fulfill your mission. Everything else, needs to be abstracted.
Yeah, Troy, so when you have a multiple cloud hybrid environment, it's like having a mansion of many windows. And so some need to be open, some need to be closed. What are some of the factors for controlling that? And again, with a reasonable amount of manpower and automation on it.
So it's interesting, Andre mentioned the manpower part too a little bit, so I want to kind of switch it a little bit. In what we've found in the industry, so the idea of going to a cloud, this conversation spins back a little bit on the automation. So traditionally, in the virtual world, or a virtualization world, a person would request an application. That would go to the virtualization guy. The virtualization guy would request a chunk of storage from the storage guy. That guy would get it approved from the networking guy to get this amount of bandwidth. And it's the spin up time. Absolutely. Spin up time becomes months for a single virtual machine. So now with the automation in a cloud workload, that is literally a click of a button and you fired up a new workload, a new virtual machine out there in the cloud. So that automation is saving manpower, but it's making that manpower more effective in a faster way. You'd mentioned the opening multiple windows. Well, there's a problem with that too. And we found it way back with the server scope creep that happened. We started to virtualize everything. Then it was very easy to stand up virtual machines. So now we had a scope creep of virtual machines. And if you go into any environment right now that has virtual machines, they're not going to know what some of those are because they got spun up for some reason and they don't know if they can turn them off or not. So it goes to the scope creep that Greg was talking about with, we've got all these virtual machines that have CPUs allocated, RAM allocated. Now we need to analyze that before we talk about that environment going to the cloud. Brandon mentioned it earlier, fixing your cloud before going to a public cloud. Same thing with the mansion and multiple windows, right? Let's make sure the right windows are open, the right windows are closed. So the idea that when we go to the cloud, we don't have the same problem that we saw with virtualization and that we saw with servers before that, and that's just multiple workloads being spun up in the cloud because it's so easy. So that analyzing that Brandon was talking about and making sure you're only spinning up, and actually Andre had mentioned, only spinning up the stuff that makes sense for your business. So, mansion's cool, but make it the right size mansion.
Sure. Brandon?
At the end of the day, it really all just comes down to the policy. And when you're able to assign these policies to your workloads and from a administrative perspective, be able to dictate what systems are going to run from what performance tier, how they're going to be stored, it gives you more control to prevent some of the things like the virtual machine creep and just being able to kind of ring all that in.
So it sounds like something Andre said very early on, and that is you've got to have the right process and architecture before you do all of this automation and all of this virtualization. Otherwise, it's like when you have a mover come and they pack up the dirty ashtrays and then they end up in your new house.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, right, or the mansion. And well, to continue with this getting tired metaphor here, if you have a house of many mansions, that means there's lots of windows that bad people can get in. And no hybrid cloud discussion would be complete without what is the latest thinking in cybersecurity. And we have the FedRAMP process, now a pretty mature process for the most part. And now even the military services in particular are looking at the higher and higher levels of secret load that can go to commercial clouds or public clouds. So where do we stand now in the cyber piece of all of this?
So I can take that to start off. So, like you said, Tom, is we are currently have approved all the way up to secret the IL6 clouds. So we are actually migrating many of the workloads that are currently done on the SIPRNet over to to IL6 clouds today. We are migrating some other higher classification systems over to cloud environments today, but we still have some work to do, frankly, with respect to how are we going to secure all of that data, and how are you going to manage the access to all that data and the different types of data, not just the classification of data, but the need to actually use particular types of data based upon who owns that data, because we still have mission owners. So who owns that data is still very, very important, and how that gets shared out is very important. So we are building an enterprise identity and credential access management framework, so that we can, regardless of what cloud environment you're in, we actually can control who has access to that with multi-factor authentication, and who can actually use that data.
Yeah. So Troy, it seems like in that environment that Greg described, you really need some kind of, I'll use the word again, an abstraction layer to be able to manage all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I gotta start this out with very cool conversation to have today. If I'd have had this conversation with you 5 years ago, the conversation would be, look, we're really not there as far as the public clouds and the federal government's comfort with their data being up there. But now we've come to such high levels of classification that a lot of these public clouds are offering a higher level of classification than they can get at their local data center. So very, very impressive. We've talked about the multi-cloud world, and now we've got to talk back to the private cloud and securing it. So there's all kinds of cool stuff going on there. The idea of ransomware, and ransomware can come and take over your entire environment, and you get to pay money, or you got to do something to get it out of this. Well, that's actually affecting the backup world now. And ransomware can affect your backups. So the idea of going back in time, that's no good anymore.
Like you resurrect the ransomware.
So yeah, absolutely. So now the idea that we're deploying is this gold cyber recovery image that is actually offline. So even if you're affected by ransomware, this is a gold copy that isn't online until you're ready to back up to it, so you can get over that ransomware. So it's another approach to the cybersecurity.
Sure. Andre?
So three items that I think are extremely important in terms of cybersecurity and the cloud. One is the fact that the vendors that are providing these services, especially in the software as a service arena, have the ability to hire the best people in the industry at prices that government agencies, quite honestly, cannot afford. Right? The best people in cybersecurity are in all likelihood not going to take $150,000 jobs in the government when they can make a lot more in the private sector. So in a lot of ways, you're basically outsourcing that service to them because their business model is dependent on the security of their platform. That gives me a large degree of comfort in terms of their desire to achieve that impenetrability. The second one is that when you're doing that across multiple agencies, right? For example, let's say a very popular email collaborative platform, right? If they were being operated at the different agencies as they used to, you have all of those people that need to be dedicated. The final issue, which for me being previously in the broadcast industry and now being in an environment that is very susceptible to foreign actors, is the issue of scalability against denial of service attacks, right? When you're looking at denial of service attacks that are now approaching the terabit per second, you need to make sure that you have that positioned outside because you can't possibly accommodate it internally.
Sure. Well, I wish we could continue, but we are out of time. Great discussion. I want to thank today's guests. I'd like to thank today's guests. Greg Judge is the Deputy Director for Operations and Architecture for the CIO G6 of the U.S. Army. Andre Mendez, CIO of the International Trade Administration at the Commerce Department. Troy Massey, Director of Enterprise Engagements at Iron Bow Technologies. And Brandon Lockhart, Director of Data Analytics at Iron Bow Technologies. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You've been listening to Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Iron Bow.
On behalf of Iron Bow Technologies, thank you for joining us. The archive session will be available shortly. If you qualified for continuing education credit, you will receive an email with your training certificate. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.